Morning, church family. I'm sorry that I'm not David Happ today, but David hasn't been well. He thought he was going to be better, but the doctor told him he needed to have another 2 weeks off. So, and we found that out on Thursday night. So today we're going to have a look at a promise that remains, and it's found in Hebrews, which we're studying our lesson on, and we studied on last week. But I want to share something a little bit extra that you might not have considered last week. But before we begin, I want to ask you a question. When you look at the state of the world today, you look around you, you see everything that's happening not only here, but overseas and in all those other countries. If I was to describe what was happening in our world, what one word do you think that I would use? Chaos? Anyone else? Corruption? Anyone else? Suffering? Control? You still haven't come up with the word that I'm actually thinking of. And if you actually read Hebrews 4 and verse 9, you might be able to work it out. Unrest. Thank you. Was that you, Toysha? Oh, sorry, Natalie, was it? Natalie, thank you. So, unrest. I would describe the world today as in absolute unrest. You know, when I looked up this word of unrest, it says an uneasy or troubled condition. Would you say that the world is in a troubled condition? Yep. Uneasy or discontent. Are there people around that are discontented today? Yep. Voter unrest over the scandals. A condition of social disturbance, often involving demonstrators or rioting. How many more riots have we seen today than we've ever seen before? The world is in a state of unrest. A state of unrest. You know, during a seemingly never-ending pandemic, a new trend has emerged on the Global Peace Index of 2021. Who's ever heard of the Global Peace Index? Yep, one person. Okay, I looked up the Global Peace Index because there's a lot of call for peace. How many people have heard of people calling for peace around the world today? Many of you have heard about peace being called for, but over the last 9 years, there has been a decline in world peace. And this Global Peace Index is something that measures the amount of peace that we have. And for the last 9 years, the last 9 years of recording, it has continually gone down and down and down. And it actually tells us that it's actually doubled in the last 10 years. Today we have civil unrest around the world that has actually doubled. Citizens around the world are protesting against a range of issues, from economic hardship and police brutality to political instability. And we see political instability in all other countries around the world, and there are many countries facing war that have never faced war before. There are many countries in war as well. And just a couple of the countries that come to my mind were America, China, Taiwan, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Colombia, Ethiopia, India, Israel, Palestine, North Korea, Sudan, Tanzania, Ukraine and Russia, to name a few. And certainly we've been hearing a lot about Ukraine and Russia in the news lately. That is if you spend the time to look at the news. And an article I read yesterday showed that the US officials are actually saying that the Russians are actually setting up this mock scene to use it as a pretense to go to war against Ukraine. In this mock scene, they're actually in this plot. They've got corpses and footage of blown up buildings, fake Ukraine military hardware, Turkish-made drones, and actors playing the part of Russian-speaking mourners. In other words, they're going to stage this attack as if Ukraine has attacked Russia, which then gives them the right to go in and take over. Now, I don't know how true that is, or whether that's something that America is using to be able to quell the tension that's rising between these two countries. But there's no uncertainty in the fact that the world is in turmoil. The world is in unrest. The world doesn't look like it's got a bright future at the moment, does it? Not only that, but we're also looking, it was recorded last year through the period of 2021 that it was the worst year for natural disasters ever. So there's certainly, when we look around the world today, not only are the people in the world in turmoil, but the world itself is in turmoil. So in light of all the unrest that's going around, is there an answer to it? Is there an answer to it? How many people look at the adult Sabbath school lesson? How many people studied Hebrews 3 and 4 last week? There's a few here. I took a class outside there, and I tried to bring something out, but I didn't really. There was still a fair bit that I had to learn. But it's something that I've been thinking about for a while now. And when David couldn't come, I thought to myself, what am I going to preach on Sabbath? This is late Thursday night. And this thought about sharing what is in Hebrews 4 and verse 9, and specifically one word I want to look at, kept coming to my mind. And I said, but yeah, we dealt with that in the lesson last week. But I feel that there was more that could be brought out about this one word, and I want to actually share this word with you today. It's a word that, I don't know, I'm looking at these guys in the second seat here, and we had a discussion when we were going through the book of Hebrews about 12 months ago, didn't we? And we got stuck on this one word as well. So there's a number of reasons why I wanted to look into this one word. And I want to share what I've actually found about this word with you today. And it's going to relate to a day, it's going to relate to a place, and it's going to relate to how we can feel in our own hearts, that can give us a state of rest amongst all the unrest that we see in the world today. So with that in mind, I want you to open your Bibles. Open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 4. And it's actually good that you've been through this passage before, many of you, because I believe that you'll get a greater blessing when we have another look at it today. Hebrews chapter 4, and I want us to look at verse 9. And it tells us there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. Now, how many times do we hear about rest in chapters 3 and 4? Can anyone tell me? It's a lot, isn't it? The whole of the chapters 3 and 4 tells us constantly that the Israelites didn't enter this rest. But then we get to this verse where it tells us that there remains then a rest for the people of God. Now, in our English language, we really miss, I believe, what Paul is trying to tell us here. And that is, what gives us a bit of a hint is that there's this one word for rest that's actually a different Greek word than all the other words for rest. And this one word for rest is unique on its own and stands out by itself in the whole of the Bible. We only see it here once. Well, one of the reasons why we don't see it in the Old Testament is because the Old Testament was not written in Greek, it was written in Hebrew. And the word for rest that I want to look at today is called sabbatismos. Now, I'm not sure if I'm saying that exactly right, but sabbatismos. And the thought is that this word means Sabbath rest or Sabbath observance. Now, when you come and find just one word in the Bible, and you need to work out how we are to interpret this word, One of the things that you can do is go to other places in the scriptures to find out how it was used and what context that was used, and then how was the context used here. The only trouble is when this one word is used just this one time, how do we then go about it? All we've basically got is the context of this chapter and the context of the book of Hebrews. But I discovered by looking at the Greek version of the Old Testament that the word is used in Greek in the Old Testament on 2 occasions. So I want to have a look at there. I want to first go back there, and then we're going to come back to have a look at this word sabbatismos and find out what it actually means in this passage. Now, the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Old Testament, and it was translated back around about the 3rd BC century, and it was done by 70 Greek-speaking Jews or Greek-speaking scholars of that time. And that's why it's called the Septuagint. But it's the Greek version, and I discovered that there was a couple of words that are used for this one word. One is sabbatismos, which we have here, and the other one is sabbatisos. One is a verb and one is a noun. One is a verb and one is a noun. And it's interesting that the verb is more keeping of the Sabbath, which is sabbatisos, but the word sabbatismos is the noun, which is the result of keeping the Sabbath. So what Paul is revealing here in Hebrews is the result of keeping the Sabbath. Does that make sense? So when he says sabbatismos, he's talking about the result, this rest that we find in keeping the Sabbath. What's the Sabbath all about? What does it mean to keep the Sabbath? I remember when I grew up that I had all these rules and regulations over what the Sabbath was. And for me, the Sabbath was all about what my activity was, whether it was good or whether it was not so good. And I remember going for a walk along the beach one day, and when I was young we weren't allowed to swim. And I started to think about these rules and these regulations, and as we were walking along the beach, the waves were washing up and a bit of wave hit my pants here and it got a little bit wet, and I was sort of thinking to myself, well, is that sinning? Where's the line between keeping the Sabbath and not keeping the Sabbath? Many years later, I discovered by looking at the Sabbath that way, I'd lost the plot about what the Sabbath was all about. I'd lost the blessing of the Sabbath. And so here I want to show that what Paul is saying through this one word, sabbatismos, he's revealing that there's a huge blessing in it if we keep it the way that it was designed to be kept. Now let's have a look at this word. So this word, going back to what we said before, the noun and the verb. The verb being sabbatizos, the noun being sabbatismos. By putting a mos on the end, it called it a noun. Now to give you an example, my wife could do this a lot better than myself. But if I was to say that I was going to inflate a ball, that would be the verb. That would be the doing part of it. When the ball's inflated, what would I call it? Inflation. Or when I saw something that had a price tag on it, and I said, that seems to be too cheap, and I put a dearer price tag on it, I've inflated the price. That's the act of inflating the price. But the noun is inflation. It's the same thing with this word, sabbatizos and sabbatismos. Sabbatismos is the blessing of keeping the Sabbath. And I want to show you what it reveals in the Old Testament. So let's have a look at Exodus chapter 16 and verse 30. Exodus chapter 16 and verse 30. And for the sake of time, I'm going to reveal to you, and you can look it up, but it basically says, so the people rested on the seventh day. Now in the Greek version, this word is sabbatismos. They rested on the Sabbath day. Now this is before the commandments were given on Mount Sinai. We find this resting on the Sabbath day. But this resting in the Greek version is sabbatismos. And the context of it is when they had the manna given to them from heaven and they were to go out and collect it. 6 days they were collected. On the 6th day they would collect twice as much. So on the 7th they didn't have to go out and collect it. They could just rest in the fact that it was there and it was sent by God above. Now the interesting thing is that Jesus uses that same analogy back then to tell people in John chapter 6 that he was the bread from heaven, helping us to understand the context of this rest, that there is rest in the fact that Jesus is the bread of life. There is rest in the fact that what he has done for us gives us eternal life. The other time this term is used in Leviticus 23 and verse 32, and it's got to do with the resting or the celebrating of the Sabbath on the Day of Atonement. This was to be a special Sabbath. This was to be a day when sin was done away with. And this is what this word is used in this context, the word sabbatismos. The blessing that comes from what Jesus was doing for us through the eradicating of sin. Restoring us back to our rightful selves. Restoring us back to our rightful selves. You know, when you look at Sabbath and the keeping of the Sabbath, the word for keeping is guarding. It's keeping it as a special time. And it's more about resting than activity. I had got it wrong when I was younger. I'd made it more about activity, but it's actually more about resting, but a special type of resting. Resting, so far what we've seen, in what Jesus has done and is doing for us. I want to show you some stuff about this sabbatizo and sabbatismos, this Sabbath that the land experienced. And I'll get you to look up these verses. Leviticus 26. Because here it talks about a land enjoying rest. And you probably think to yourself, well, how can a land enjoy rest? But here it tells us in Leviticus 26, starting at verse 33, I will scatter you among the nations and draw out a sword after you. Your land shall be desolate and your cities waste. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate and you are in your enemy's land. And the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate, it shall rest. For that time it did not rest on the Sabbaths when you dwelt in it. Why didn't it rest? Because verse 27 tells us, after all this, if you do not obey me, but walk contrary to me, and then I will also walk contrary to you. So basically, God is saying here, if you've decided to be at unrest with me, I'm going to put you out of the land. I'm going to let your enemies take you over. And then the land will enjoy its Sabbath rests. So the land's going to enjoy its Sabbath rest because it wasn't enjoying its Sabbath rest. Why? Because the people in it were not living in harmony with God. Does that make sense? If we're not living in harmony with God, we can't find this rest that's being spoken of here. 2 Chronicles 14 and verse 6 tells us that another reason why the land had rest is because there was no war in it. And earlier on it tells us because there was no conflict in it. So the land was enjoying this Sabbath rest, this sabbatizo, this Sabbath rest because of three main things. One is that it was now living in harmony with God because the people in it were out of there who weren't living in harmony with God. Because there was no war in it, because the people who were in it were warring with others, weren't in it as well. So it was enjoying this Sabbath rest because they were in harmony with God, there was allegiance to God, and they had rested, it was resting in submission to God. Resting in submission to God. Now the cool thing is that when we look at Hebrews in the context of Hebrews, and we shared this a little bit in our lesson this morning, the context of Hebrews. The context of Hebrews is that Jesus is being portrayed to the Hebrews as one who is better than the prophets, better than the angels, better than Moses himself, and he is in fact, in chapters 3 and 4, the only one who can offer true rest. He's the only one that can offer this rest that the Israelites didn't achieve. And when we look through the passage of Hebrews 3 and 4, we find why didn't they achieve? Well, we find that it was the same reason that the land wasn't enjoying its Sabbath rest. So when we put those two parallels together, we found that the land was in harmony with God because there was no rebellion. The land was in allegiance with God because there was no war, and the land rested in submission to God because there was no conflict. And we find in Hebrews 3 and 4 that they never entered the rest that God designed for them. Why? Because they were in rebellion. They were sinning. In other words, sin is like being the enemy of God, so they were at war with God. And verse 12 tells us they were in conflict. The reason they didn't achieve the rest is because they weren't living in harmony with God, they weren't in allegiance with God, and they hadn't rested in submission to God. I want to share with you today why the world is in so much conflict. The world is in so much conflict because it's in rebellion to God's ways. It's sinning against God, it's at war with God, and it's in conflict with God. And you know, when we come back into allegiance with God, that's only when we will find true rest. I'm reminded of the time that I came back to God around 16 or 17 years ago. From being in conflict with God for 20 years of my life, I finally handed over my life to God, and I tell you what, the peace that I found was indescribable. I had never experienced it before. And if you don't experience that peace today, maybe you need to question yourself on how much you are actually living in harmony with God and His ways. How much you are in allegiance with God, and how much you are just resting in submission to God. You know, when we have difficult things to face with, if we can just hand it over to God and let go. But so often we go, God, can you take this from? And we don't see it happening straight away. We go, oh, I better take the reins back, God. You're doing nothing about it. And we're not happy to rest in God. Now, the interesting thing is that we find in Hebrews that the reason for the rebellion, the being at war and being in conflict was all due to unbelief. All due to unbelief. Unbelief. Unbelief leads to a state of, there we really could say, is unbelief leads to a state of unrest, couldn't we? Whereas belief will lead to a state of true rest. Belief in what? Belief in what? Well, Hebrews 3 and verse 1 tells us that we need to consider the apostle and the high priest, Jesus Christ. We need to consider him. We need to actually give him some thought. And we know from history that he was a real character. He was a real person, that he did actually do the things that the Bible claimed him to do. We can trust that. So consider him. Chapter 3 and verse tells us that we need to listen to his voice. Chapter 4 tells us, by believing in his gospel, we can be changed and we can have a new life. And then chapters 4 chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. I love this section because it tells us that we can, because of what Jesus has done for us and is currently doing for us as our high priest, we can find grace in our time of need. We can find unmerited favour. We can find something that we don't deserve, and we can come boldly to Him because of what He has done for us, if we just confess and open up our lives to Him. So Hebrews talks about this rest. The Old Testament talks about a land that found rest. And Hebrews also talks about a certain place where rest was offered, but rest wasn't achieved. And I believe that that was their land of promise. If they had have followed God's commands, they would have found rest in the land of promise. I want to share with you that there's two other places that are called a place of God's rest. And one, we get it from verse 10. Let's actually have a look at this. Hebrews 4. Let's go back to Hebrews. Hebrews 4. I'm going to read verse 9 and 10. There remains therefore a rest for the people of God, for he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works as God did from his. Here it tells us that God found rest after the works in where? The Garden of Eden, did someone say? The Garden of Eden. He found rest. You know, when we look at the account of the Garden of Eden, we find that after God made everything, He said, and it was good. It was good, it was good, and He made man, and He said it was very good. It was very good. Why was it very good? Why was it very good? There was no rebellion. There was no war. There was no conflict at all in this place. That's what made it good. That's what made it a place where God rested. He didn't need physical rest, but He rested because everything was in submission to Him. Everything was in harmony with Him, and everything was in allegiance with Him. They were all on the same page, and they all had rest. Another place that is called this is heaven. Heaven is this other place where we find the same sort of thing, and we only have to look at Revelation 21 to find out that heaven is everything that earth isn't. There's no sickness, there's no sadness, there's no suffering, there's no unrest in heaven. Because when we get to heaven, everything will be living in harmony with God. Everything will be in allegiance with our Creator, and everything will be rested in the submission of God. So how is this related to Sabbath rest? How is this related to Sabbath rest? You know, in the Bible, we find in the first 2 chapters, we find a perfect world. A perfect world in rest with their Creator. We don't find that again until the last 2 chapters of Revelation. In between, there is all this unrest, and all this unrest has come about through sin. But we find that there's a solution, and the solution is the Sabbath. You know, I find it very interesting that the first thing that man got to experience after he was created was rest. The first thing that he got to experience, because after the 6th day, the 7th day was the Sabbath. Hebrews also, I believe, gives us this picture of this Sabbath being this place that restores rest. You know, when we look at creation, we had this perfect world, everything in harmony with God. So man was created on the 6th day, and then they rested. we find that Jesus came down, and John records it as Jesus coming down to recreate everything anew. And on the sixth day he did what? He died for you and I. And what did he do on the seventh day? He rested and gave us rest again. He wanted to restore that rest. Now, it's not going to be completely restored until the Lord comes, but what we find is that the Sabbath rest here, this Sabbatismos, is tied up in God as our Creator and God as our Redeemer. And the Sabbath represents this true rest. This is what the Sabbath was designed for. When Mark said that Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, he was saying it was made to be a blessing. It was made to rest in and to find that rest in a place of unrest. So there remains then a rest. A rest for who? Hebrews tells us that there remains then a rest, and it remains for those who consider Jesus, for those who listen to his voice, for those who exercise faith in him, and for those who cease from their own works of earning salvation. One of the biggest traps that the devil has for us today is to say that if you're good enough, God can save you. It kept me away from a relationship with God for many years of my life. You know, and sometimes when I see people in palliative care, and I just want to make sure that they are right with the Lord, and so often I hear them say, I hope I've done enough. I hope I've done enough. And I reveal to them, I'm saying, well, I'm sorry you haven't done enough. But I don't leave it there. But God has done enough for you. Jesus has done enough for you. Jesus has done. Rest in that fact. Know that that is what it is. When the thief died on the cross, I believe what Jesus was telling him, that you will be in paradise with me. That word for paradise is Eden. It's the place where there's no conflict, where the place where there's no unrest. There is a place where he's in allegiance with God and he's in submission to God, and he can rest in that fact. Paul uses, I believe, this unique word in Hebrews to describe the true rest that we can find in Jesus. When we live our life in harmony and submission to him, we will find that rest, that peace that only Jesus can give. Paul also uses this word to confirm that this rest is experienced in Sabbath keeping. Not Sabbath keeping how I thought it was, but Sabbath keeping how God designed it to be. A day that was set apart where we don't do our work, where we don't earn, where we just rest and enjoy that time growing in our relationship to Jesus, being in allegiance with him, not being in conflict with him, not being in war with him. So it's like this Sabbath day, once a week, we actually get a time where we can go, okay, let's step apart and let's make sure that I'm in line with God again. Remember that he's your creator. Remember that he's your redeemer. And so Paul gave us that to confirm that it will be universally experienced again when we get to heaven. So when Paul was saying in Hebrews, there remains then this Sabbatismos, he's sharing this special rest that we can only achieve in Jesus, but we will also achieve when we get to heaven, when the land and the entire universe will be in rest with God. I want to invite you today, as you contemplate this word Sabbatismos, as I have yesterday, that you will see what he's really trying to get at, what Paul is really trying to get at. And that is that this rest, yes, it's tied up in the Sabbath, because the Sabbath is a celebration of the fact that God is our creator and that God is our redeemer. But he wants us to truly rest in him. Next time you hear someone say Happy Sabbath to you, think about those words, because it is happy. We can be joyous knowing what Jesus has done for us, and we can rest in that.